أصحاب المعالي، أصحاب السعادة، السيدات والسادة الحضور ومتابعينا من خلف الشاشات. Your Excellencies, dear distinguished guests. نرحب بكم مرة أخرى في الجلسة الأولى. نرحب بكم مرة أخرى في جلسات المؤتمر الدولي لتقويم التعليم والتدريب، تجويد نواتج التعليم ودعم النمو الاقتصادي، الذي تنظمه هيئة تقويم التعليم والتدريب بالشراكة مع الأمانة السعودية لمجموعة العشرين. It's our pleasure to welcome you again to our thematic sessions of the International Conference on Education and Training Evaluation, Improving Learning Outcomes and Supporting Economic Growth, organized by the Education and Training Evaluation Commission in partnership with the G20 Saudi Secretariat. ندعوكم الآن لمتابعة الجلسة الثانية لهذا اليوم بعنوان الإفادة من بيانات التقويم من خلال البحوث والتقارير. يدير الجلسة الدكتور سطام السبيعي، مشرف عام برنامج استشراف مركز المعلومات الوطني. We invite you to the second thematic session of the day entitled Assessment Data for Research and Reporting, moderated by Dr. Sattam السبيعي, the Supervisor General of Estishraf Program. فليتفضل دكتور سطام السبيعي مشكورا.
Ladies and gentlemen, a nice transition from the previous session. Our colleagues just talked about the importance of data in evaluating the education output. So it is my pleasure to welcome you to this discussion that will be themed around the assessment of data for research and reporting. Education, to many, is a lifelong target where the aim is to continuously develop into a better individual. One definition of education is to achieve full development and realization of individual human beings. Unfortunately, many children and adults find it extremely difficult to enjoy this basic right. According to a UNESCO report, the basic foundation of the education of human beings lays principally on being able to understand, read, write, and calculate. These essential life skills translate into the broader term of literacy. To achieve this noble, seemingly easy target is no picnic. A great number of challenges arise along the way. These challenges come in the form of gauging existing policies and creating new ones. This problem morphs into a more complex version once you incorporate tertiary skills, higher education, and indirect impacts of these outcomes. The significance of education systems stems from the fact that education forms a foundation for every other domain. Having that foundation in an improper state would greatly hinder the growth of developing countries and will eclipse the great progress that developed countries made over the decades. This is where data comes in. In modern times, data has been an integral ingredient of development in all fields. It drives economic growth, social development, and ensures security and safety of communities around the world. Education system does not fall short of that list, and for previously mentioned reasons, it must take precedence with all of its complexity, diversity, and depth. Data plays a critical role in understanding and improving it in a proper fashion. Data, regardless of domain, comes with a lot of great challenges, but it brings even greater opportunities once it's sufficiently collected and utilized. To truly unleash the power of data, humanity must pragmatically put in place a regulatory framework that ensures privacy, protection, proper collection, and ethical use. Saudi Arabia, driven by its ambitious 2030 vision, is aiming to reach excellence through a multitude of programs improving education, both directly and indirectly. Saudis are eager to extend this ambition and help our regional and global friends and partners around the world through our responsibility as a G20 member and a host of its current summit. During this session, we'll spend a bit over 2 hours engaged in a series of valuable presentations and Q&A sessions to discuss the vast improvement opportunities to global and local education systems that is achievable through data-based practices. Our esteemed panelists are renowned professionals in their respective fields. We have with us today His Excellency Dr. Tareq Alshedi, the President of National Data Management Office in Saudi Arabia, Dr. Silvia Montoya, Director of the UNESCO Institute of Statistics, Dr. Paulo Santiago, Head of the Policy Advice and Implementation Division at the OECD, Dr. Shwetlena Sabarwal, a Senior Economist at the World Bank Group, Dr. Nayyaf Aljabri, the Director General for Research and Innovation at the Education and Training Evaluation Commission in Saudi Arabia. Before we start, I would like to remind the viewers that they can send their questions through the chat function, and we will try to cover as much as we can from these questions at the end of the session. In our first session, it is my pleasure to introduce His Excellency Dr. Tareq Alshedi, the President of National Data Management Office at the Saudi Data and AI Authority. Dr. Tareq held a number of leadership positions during his career, most notably served as the Deputy for Planning and Development at the Presidency of State Security, served as General Supervisor for the Management of the National Information Center as Director General of the Center, and was the Director of Nayyaf Academy for National Security and advisor to the Director General of Mabahith. He was also the Director of the Technical Development Project in Security Affairs at the Ministry of Interior, Head of the Systems Development Department at King Fahd Security College, advisor to the National Guard Hospital, King Abdulaziz City. Alshedi has got a PhD in computing and bioinformatics from George Mason University in the US, a higher diploma in social network analysis from the same university, a master's degree in management from King Saud University, a bachelor's degree in computer science from the same institution, and a bachelor's degree in security sciences from King Fahd Security College. Your Excellency.
Thank you. Thank you, Sattam. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على أشرف الأنبياء والمرسلين.
In the name of Allah, the Beneficent, the Merciful, all praise due to Allah, peace and blessings be upon the Prophet Muhammad's family and companions.
And I'm thankful for Dr. Hussam and the team of ETEC to invite me to shed some lights on the role of National Data Management Office in maximizing the benefits of the data. And before I start my presentation, let me give some history of e-data or electronic data in Saudi Arabia. Our visionary leaders realized the importance of the data long time ago. So they established the National Information Center as a repository for store, process, and share the information of the citizens, expats, visitors, and pilgrims. I think the age of NIC is much more than the age of most of the people here in the conference. So after that, we were doing very well until the explosion of the information age. Then the agencies in Saudi Arabia, different agencies, start to or enforced to have their own data centers there is a lot of demand. I don't want to say that NIC cannot respond to their demand, but there is a lot of demand, so that we need to do it ourselves. So then we create a lot of silos of our island of information. And these islands actually caused a lot of problem related to personal data protection, and some problems related to data management and governance. So after that, the Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman came up with the Vision 2030. And we start to do the workshop or discussion, and we discovered that we have a lot of problems. If we want to get to the target of the Vision 2030, we have to solve these problems. So as a lead of the board, he decided to establish the National Data Management Office. And from there, we start our journey. So to start our journey, we decide to follow principles. So the eight national data principles that we came up, first one is data as a national assets. The problem of the data ownership, we have to stop it, and we start instead of that, the data stewardship. So no ownership, no more ownership. This is not my data is not there anymore. Then the second principle is about data privacy by design. Privacy by design means that you have to take the privacy in mind during the life cycle of the development of any application. The third principle, open by default. So open data is the default unless classified otherwise. Also, we have to use the data ethically. The design should be very purposeful, data-driven outcomes. We have to create awareness and learning culture in personal data protection and in data management. Trusted data. Trusted here means that it's trusted by the government agencies to use the data, that the quality is high, and also the individuals trusted us that we are using their data in the right way. So our mission is to managing and enriching data as a national assets while protecting the personal and sensitive data. How can we do that? Is by developing the strategy, standard, policy, and also we have to building the capacity and maintain the compliance of these regulations. So the strategic themes for our strategy: empower data-driven government decision-making, enabling data-driven innovation, enhancing citizen outcome or user experience, protect personal data, foster public trust in how their data is being used. So we came up with the 6 strategic objectives. If you look at it, it's like a journey, starting by developing the strategy for the data management and personal data protection. Then for this strategy, we need policy, standard, and regulation and laws to achieve that strategies. Okay, we have the strategy, we have the standard and laws and regulation. We need to support the government agencies actually to understand these regulations, to apply it the right way. Also, we need to establish a compliance indicators to make sure that they are follow the right the strategies and the standards in the right direction. Also, we need to monitor this compliance against regulation and policies. And at the end, we have to build the national capability or national capacity. As you know, we have a very, we have lack of expertise in, especially in data, in personal data protection. So we need to build that capacity. So The plan here, actually, what we did in the sixth one, we have a project now. It will be signed soon to train 1,000 trainee in 3 programs. The first one is to train the IT guys on the laws. So the IT will understand the privacy laws, so it will be privacy by design in their mind. The second one is to train the law people with the IT. So now we have this law and regulation, and we need them to understand the IT behind that. And the third one, and this is the longest program, it's data science, which will cover the KSA, what do we call it? The KSA National Data Management Protection Framework. The third will cover the and data usage. That's why it will be a long program for the students. And then we came with this KSA National Data Management and Protection Framework, which consists of 21 domains. And this is tailored to Saudi Arabia. And it's actually, we used many different best practices to come up with this governance model. So now we have the data management part, we finished with that. Then we developed actually many policies, some of them in the kitchen now, in the pipeline, some of them under development, and some of them now in the public opinion, and some of them now approved by the board, and now in the implementation phase in the agencies. So we have personal data protection policy, freedom of information policy, data classification policy, data sharing policy, revenue model policy, open data policy, all of them approved by the board, except the revenue model is still in the public opinion phase. Great. Now we have this policy for our standards, and we have this standard for the data management. Actually, we developed a standard book for data management consisting of 191 specifications. It's like a checklist. If you follow it, you will be able to understand exactly where are you in the area of data management. And this is used by the head of the departments to understand where are they in this area. So we're done with that. We're done with the data management, and we're done with the individual or personal data protection. So how we apply it? We are very limited in the data management office and on individuals, and employees. So what should we do? So also we go back again to the board, and we suggest that we have to have data offices in all government agencies, and it's actually approved by the board. And we got a royal decree to establish a data office in each government entity. So our organization here for that one, actually, we divide it into different domains, like health sector domain, telecoms domain, and financial domain or sector. And why we did that? Because each sector has its own regulation and personal data protection practice based on the nature of the sector. If we go to health sector, if you look at United States, you will find they have this HIPAA regulation just for the personal data information in healthcare. They have different exchange IT specialized for the health care systems. So my recommendation or our recommendation that in the office is for your conference is to establish a data office or data governance in each agency, private sector or government sector. This will help the enrichment of the data and maximize the benefit of the data. And thank you.
Thank you so much, Your Excellency. That was very informative. We all know that INDEMO was established last year.
Yeah, this is something we will celebrate our first anniversary actually in 9 days from now. So thank you.
So now, enabling data-driven innovation and economic development is a key strategy theme. In your opinion, as the head of the highest regulatory entity for data in the kingdom, how can we balance between the data governance and preserving privacy and the innovation by using data? What's the balance strike between those two?
Okay, thank you. In fact, as I said, we have the balance here is the data management and the data privacy and the data protection. So if we go back again to the practice of data management, and if we train our people on the right direction in the data management, and we train them very well on personal data protection, I'm sure that we will reach the innovation without, I mean, we will balance between the personal data protection and the innovation. So I think our policy that we have issued, taking in consideration that we will not disrupt the economic growth by issuing a very strict and harsh regulation.
Great. Thank you so much, Your Excellency. Now, in our second session, it is my pleasure to introduce Dr. Silvia Montoya with her presentation titled The Role of Learning Assessment Data in Achieving the Learning Goal of Education 2030 Agenda. Dr. Silvia Montoya is the director of the UNESCO Institute of Statistics. Since the adoption of the Sustainable Development Goals, SDG, Dr. Montoya has taken a leadership role within the international education community by helping to build consensus around the standards, methodologies, and indicators needed to measure progress towards Education 2030. She has also launched the Global Alliance to Monitor Learning and serves as the co-chair of the Technical Cooperation Group on SDG 4, Education 2030 Indicators. Prior to joining the UIS in 2015, Silvia was the Director General of and Evaluation of Education Quality at the Ministry of Education, Buenos Aires, where she oversaw the creation of the first comprehensive education quality index produced in Argentina. Dr. Silvia.
Thank you very much. Let's see if I am. It's a really a great pleasure to be with you today and to hear for such an exciting panel to be and to hear all the progress you have made. And I would like to actually to share and to have this conversation about the 2030 agenda. What are the objectives that are actually tracking SDG 4, and try to see how the international community has agreed on the measurement of indicators to try to monitor on the learning and skills of kids and youths and adults. So we really want to depart from these big numbers that are related to the size of the global crisis. I think that it's always good that we keep in mind of how many kids and youths we're talking that are not able to read and to dominate even very simple skills, as doing very simple math operation or to read paragraph and to extract the meaning of that. Unfortunately, we know that from those kids, 2/3 of them are in schools, and this is actually a huge problem for us to ask and to wonder how we can improve our policy making and our teaching and learning process in the way we have been this year in particular, particularly affected by a new phenomenon that is actually affecting all over the globe, the kids and youth, and actually challenging our lives. But just to get an idea, is like to get a sense of what is does it feel to read poorly. This is a real case and the speed. We have actually given the same paragraph to kids in one group of countries, OECD, and you have in the low-income countries. And this is exactly, after all, the moment that the kids in the low-income countries reach the same level of progress that the kids in developed countries. That is one of the first way of actually getting a sense. And just to have a clear visualization of what are the skills that the kids are not able to master. For instance, the kids in low-income countries cannot identify what is the number that is missing in that sequence. It's a clear example coming from real life that shows what is the type of skills that we talk, and we know that they are not too sophisticated, but still they are for some part of the kids. So with that, actually, as an answer to that, the SDG 4 agenda has come in education to try to look at all the abilities, to look at to have the relevant skills. And now we know that the relevant skills are not only reading and mathematics, but there are other technical and vocational skills that allow us to have a decent life, a decent employment. But it means a lot of diversity that goes beyond identifying a number in a sequence. For this reason, we have 10 targets in SDG 4, and we look at the lifelong cycle. We go from pre-primary to primary education to secondary to higher education. We talk about the connection to work and the levels of literacy and numeracy in adult population, as well as the environment where those skills are created. So it's a comprehensive agenda, and within that, we have the data measurement are key to that. And just focusing specifically on the learning assessment and skills, we have various indicators that are in the Sustainable Development 4 that are related to measurement skills and learning. We have in early childhood, the pre-primary education where the kids are developmentally on track. That means the socio-emotional and cognitive skills as well to be prepared to start schools. Then we have basic education that we look at different moments in the schooling process, but we also look at technical skills. We look at ICT skills. Can we manage mobiles, computers? Can we drop files? Can we have more sophisticated skills? But also we look how we relate to others and how we relate to the environment, what kind of skills we need to have, what behavioral kind of attitudes we have towards the environment and to sciences that are very important, and also to the cultural aspect and to citizenship, how we live with each other, how we do respect the other in terms of the differences and the diversity. And unfortunately, we have made some exercises with the colleagues in the international community in trying to understand how is the work going with these numbers that we have about the measurement and the data we have. And so we know that we're really not evolving very well towards the progress we have promised, that by 2030 we will have, for instance, in target 4.1, that all the kids and youth in basic education are going to have the basic set of skills. The projections show, if you see the blue line, that on average we're going to be more or less as we are today. Eventually we're going to include more kids, but as they include, we need to have more talent to develop the set of skills, but we need to grow at the rate that is a great line, while we're going at the green at the level of the blue line, and taking the country that has done the best in the last decade. In the best case, we're going to go like as an orange line. So we really have a deficit, we have a gap, and in some cases, we don't even have a measurement to make those projections. If we go to early childhood, we also see that clearly there is a difference between the countries. We see early childhood or pre-primary education as a way to prepare our kids to enter the basic education and the rest of the learning process. And we see that there are huge differences between different regions of the world. And it's a call for looking at that and to try to see that it depends not only on one country, it's at the international community level that we need to develop those skills. We also know regarding ICT skills, we know that technology is important, and the COVID-19 has put at the center of the table how important is technology. Not only the access, but also to be able to use in an effective way, to be interacting, to be able to actually to manage a more sophisticated set of skills. The information of the indicator that collects on those set of skills in youth and adult population are showing that also we have an important number of population in the world, according to numbers, that manage skills that are a basic level, to turn off a phone, to turn off a computer, to eventually look and explore it. But when we turn to more sophisticated skills, preparing a presentation, doing a kind of more sophisticated edition in documents, or just getting into other difficult tasks, then we reduce the proportion of the population, and this is basically located in the most developed countries or the high-income countries. So this shows, and the projections are really not allowing us to be too optimistic. And then we look at the central factor in the teaching and learning process that are teachers. We see that we aspire to have qualified teachers for every child in the world, and we could see that this indicator is not even going in the right direction. We see that in some regions we're going, and the trend in the last decade has been towards a decrease in the proportion of teachers that are qualified, and we know how important it is in the current circumstances. So numbers are important, data are important, and really are showing to us that we need to actually go. And this is one point that I really wanted to raise, is that still we lack a lot of information. If we have as a reference a little bit over 200 countries in the world, and we're lacking information for 80 about basic education skills, we're really in a difficult situation to even understand how to help and how to deal to drive the right policies. We know that we need to find a way to compare better different sources of information, but this is one step that follows to the measurement, and there is a lot of effort to try to see how we use the different sources, how we use national assessment, how international assessment could be equated between the different initiatives, the ones that the colleagues are having from the OECD, the ones that IEA with team and peers are having. How do they express them in a comparative way? This is a part of efforts that we're doing. And we need also that one of the limitations is that we're not looking at all the range of diversity of skills. We have still a main focus on reading and mathematics, and a few other cognitive domains, like some knowledge about the air sciences and some knowledge about the global citizenship, and some knowledge about digital skills, but we're still not looking at a broader set of skills that are explaining and helping us to understand how to make a country progress. And there is a little bit, not too much investment in assessing some other skills that are critical, such as creativity, sort of non-cognitive domains, that are very important also as part of the integral and comprehensive development of the kids. And so we know that there are, in some of the cases, duplication of effort, that we're really not clear how much they cost, that in some of the cases we need to produce more global public goods that are going to be making easier for many countries to measure learning assessment and results, but these are part of the issues that we really need to address as a community. And we know that data is very important. We know that data we have just been hearing, but we have a system level assessment. If we look at the country and we look at the different tools in a systemic way, we know that we need to monitor what are the standards. We have been hearing about protection to privacy data. So we need that guidelines and a guiding framework and operating framework is important. So the systemic level is important, and we need to understand about curriculums, about how the system are evaluating all the different actors. So this is really not that much spread. And we know that at the school and student level, the assessment could provide us information about how the school is doing, what aspect of the schooling to improve, is the environment, is the lack of resources, is the management level, is the teaching level, and we need to have the information about the learning outcomes that are the result of the school, and we need that information for taking decisions, and we need to expand the measurement, and we need to have the data to understand what is happening. So we already know also that there are very good impact of having information. This is actually taking on the use of data coming from the international assessment that has been going through decades, like OECD, PISAs, and IEA's team and peers. And there is an identification that when the country has been using that information, it has positive impact in various dimensions, including the outcomes of the student. It has driven, in some cases, curriculum reforms. It has been enacted the improvement and the establishment of monitoring system at the country level. So we know that it has been a positive effect coming from there. And we know that always the countries are going to have to face choices. Should I do a national assessment or should I join the cross-national assessment if I have a limitation of resources? As always, there are pros and cons about each of the options. There are ownership issues, there are a huge investment in human capacity at the human level in the international assessment to allow a comparability and to allow good quality and the implementation of standards. But we know that this question tag about should I do national or cross-national is still part of the guidance the international community needs. So we know that to progress towards SDG 4, we really need to actually try to focus on an approach that is looking beyond the average and trying to look at how are all the countries doing, and within the country, how the different segments of the population are doing, that look at quality and learning. For this reason, learning assessment are important because the educational system speak of the quality of the students they are preparing to actually to face the 21st century, that we have going over reading and mathematics only and trying to incorporate other domains to try to have a long life approach to the measurement, not only looking at one point, but looking at different moments, because eventually we're doing well in one level and we're not doing well in the other level. And to try to talk and to work with other sectors. This is one of the big drivers of the Sustainable Development Goals, are these cross collaboration and interlinkages. And then we need also to talk and to work closely with the regional and global collaboration with our peers of the countries to learn from each other, to try to see what we can learn at the regional level, what we could learn at the global level. So we really need that, we know that we need a further investment into methodologies and the investment to help the countries to measure learning assessment. We have already identified those numbers. We know that the countries are still 25%, a quarter of the countries are still investing less than 4% of the GDP. That was the minimum level that the Education Framework for Action was requesting the countries as an agreement by all ministers of education of the planet. So we know that we have a lot to do, and we have to actually to try to improve the data. So learning assessment are critical, and we know from the experience that they are making a huge contribution to a better understanding of how an educational system works and how to have better skills in the country. So thank you so much for the opportunity to share with you our thoughts. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. So one thing that you mentioned that caught my attention in the middle of your presentation was a point that you made, is that sometimes there is time gaps. So how does this affect the systems evaluation? If there is a major time gap, like the example that you mentioned, it could be up to 6 years in the example that you mentioned. So how does this affect the policy making? Is it going to be time sensitive?
Yeah, I mean, this is actually, thank you so much, Sattam. Is really very good question. We really recommend that the periodicity in the measurement is not less than 3 years. Really, for this reason, we have the major international assessment that are actually done in a regular basis, trying to follow this. We know that we cannot change from one year to the other a policy and have an impact, but at the same time, we need to have time bounded and to have an impact. We have ways of simulation, and there is where international artificial intelligence and other aspects could help us to understand and to do simulation, but we really, for the policymaker and for understanding of the system and for the engagement at the country level, we really need that the countries are adopting, and this is a recommendation of the international community, to try to have at least every 3 years a measurement, and this is how we have to look. That is not one shot, but a lifelong compromise, also a commitment from the countries to measurement.
Great. One thing that you also mentioned in your presentation, you mentioned cognitive skills. Do you think cognitive skills or soft skills should contribute or should be used in a global benchmark? And are there examples of such benchmark? And how can we actually measure that, how can we measure those skills, the soft and cognitive skills?
Yes, I think actually this is one of the aspects that I think that we have we need development. We have in the cognitive dimension there is an agreement, and we have an agreement of a few indicators in the framework that are going to be measurement and have a definition of a regional level. And this is a conversation that is happening this year in terms of setting benchmark at the regional level. We have that the European Union has done a good effort in actually progressing towards that with a few indicators. But the aspect of the non-cognitive and the socio-emotional and these soft skills is an area that still is under development. There are obviously very good progress, but still we're actually coming to terms to what are the ones that could be measured in a comparable way. I think that there is already an identification. Colleagues obviously here in the panel from OECD has done an effort towards developing some of those tools, but I still the international community needs to agree on this, but I think that this is a very relevant aspect. And now we see that during this 2020 with the challenge of the COVID-19, that these are more important than ever.
Sure, thank you so much again, Dr. Silvia. Now, in our third session, it is my pleasure to introduce Dr. Paulo Santiago. Dr. Paulo is the head of the Policy Advice and Implementation Division at the OECD. And his presentation is titled Using Evaluation and Assessment Data to Strengthen the Evidence for Policy Development and Promote Informed Dialogue in Education. So Dr. Paulo is the head of the Policy Advice and Implementation Division within OECD Directorate for Education and Skills. He takes a leading role in the provision of evidence-based advice on education policy to OECD members and partner countries, both collectively and individually, across all sectors of education. Mr. Santiago joined the OECD in 2000 as an analyst. He assumed responsibility for a number of large-scale cross-country reviews covering a range of education policy areas, including teacher policy, tertiary education policy, educational evaluation and assessment, use of resources in school education, and school funding. This work generated OECD policy lines, analytical frameworks, developmental work for future data collections, as well as much information about country practices. He also led reviews of teacher policy, tertiary education policy, educational evaluation policy, and school resource use in over 25 countries. Mr. Santiago holds a PhD in economics from Northwestern University, United States. Dr. Santiago.
Many thanks. It's a great pleasure to be here with you today and to bring to this discussion the extensive OECD work on evaluation and assessment. And let me also congratulate you for bringing this topic for discussion. I think it's the reflection of the many developments in Saudi Arabia on evaluation and assessment in general, and also in education in particular, through in particular the work of ETEC, with which we have the pleasure to collaborate, including in the organization of this conference. So thank you very much for this opportunity. Today I'll be basing my presentation on the work on policy that we've done in this area, and I'll focus in particular on the uses of student assessment data at all levels of education with the objective of improving student learning outcomes. So let me give you a very quickly first an overview of my presentation. First of all, I will situate the presentation in the overall evaluation and assessment framework, which is quite extensive in education. Then I'll focus and mention in particular what type of uses student assessment data can have in order to improve, what are the different channels to improve student learning outcomes. And then I will basically go one by one through each of these channels to basically get into more detail on how to basically implement this. So first, let me first give you an overview and to situate this presentation in the overall evaluation and assessment framework. So we've done an extensive piece of work, and we continue actually to build on it, on evaluation and assessment policies in about 30 OECD countries. And the final comparative report is called Synergies for Better Learning. And we basically had an holistic approach to evaluation and assessment by reviewing all elements of evaluation and assessment in the education system, not only system evaluation, but also at student, teacher, school level, and also school leader level. And at each level, the results of evaluation and assessment, including assessment data, can be used with three main functions: accountability for development, for improvement of practices, and also diagnostic in order to improve those practices. And at different levels, at student, teacher, school, education system level, each of these functions basically have different translations in terms of what they mean. For instance, at the school level, it's about the improvement function, it's about school development and how to develop the school. And also the accountability aspect is more related to the rewards and potential sanctions that the school might have as a result of the evaluations. So we've looked at all these issues and the interconnections between them, take into account, for instance, that a tool such as student assessment data can actually be used at the different levels. So they all interlink, and this is why it's important to have an holistic approach to evaluation and assessment. Within this framework, then we have the specific use of student assessment data, and I'm more focusing actually on standardized assessment data, which can be used at different levels of the framework, and with three major channels in terms of how it can lead to better student learning outcomes. So the first channel, and I will present each one of them in more detail. The first channel is essentially the sharing of the data for public information. So it's a means in particular to generate accountability at the system level and also to promote school choice, for instance. A second aspect is actually use the data and student assessment data to build evidence for policy planning and development. And then a third aspect is improvement of practices at the different levels. So I will now elaborate on each one of the three of them. Of course, the big question is the use of data. I mean, countries are more and more facing the dilemma of generating quite a lot of data, but then not being able to actually use it, analyze it in order to improve student learning outcomes. So the objective is really how to best use the data, take into account that more and more the systems are generating great amounts of data. So a first major channel through which student assessment data can be used to improve student learning outcomes is actually involves the whole management of the data and how to share it. So a first step is actually to design the evidence base. So a reflection about what are the type of data that you need to inform your policy development, to make sure that the public in general can have scrutiny over the system. So for this, you actually need a deep reflection on the type of data you need to actually capture the whole range of student learning objectives, making sure that you're covering all the objectives and that you're actually monitoring all of these. This involves a number of things, a number of instruments in particular. You need to actually develop an education indicators framework to reflect about what type of indicators you need to monitor your education system. Things such as simply the level of funding every year in a country, how you distribute that funding across different levels of education, what are the rates, the graduation rates of your system, a range of indicators about the performance of the system at the system level. Then you also need to monitor in particular the main area, which are student learning outcomes. You need a strategy to monitor those student learning standards. So typically countries use national assessments, which can be full cohort or based on samples. Then they also use, of course, international surveys for international benchmarking, but they need to go also beyond the quantitative and collect a range of qualitative information, such as, for instance, overviews of evaluations of schools performed by the agency performing school evaluation. It can include key stakeholder surveys, for instance, asking parents about the state of education in the country. And the third element is the need to actually have basic demographic information about students and schools to be able to relate these to the outcomes themselves. Another instrument that is useful is to follow in a longitudinal way a particular student cohorts, because it gives you very specific information. Then you need to actually reflect about how to manage this knowledge and the data you created, and create it in a way that makes it efficient for the users. So this involves the establishment of protocols to harmonize, define the indicators, for instance, making sure that you have data, information, and management systems that are used and targeted at different users, making sure there's methodological documentation, and then you have a reflection about how to make the information public, or at least part of it. And many countries have basically developed school web portals and annual state of education types of reports, statistical reports. So there's a range of ways to make sure that the general public and different stakeholders in particular have access to this information. One particular example, one of the things you can do to actually hold schools accountable is to take the results of student assessment, standardized assessment across the country, and publish it. So it's a dilemma in terms of policy, whether country should publish this at the school level or not. And many countries don't do it, many others do it, because there's actually pros and cons. Of course, the public reporting of student data at the school level creates incentives for better performance. It might provide opportunities for recognition and rewards, and it provides information for parents and society, in particular for public school choice for parents. However, it can have a range of detrimental effects, as demonstrated in the literature. First of all, raw student assessment data reflects more than school impact. The results, the average results of assessments reflect more than school impact, and it can distort because there's different other influences, particular socioeconomic backgrounds of students, and therefore they can actually also influence the results. So the raw results of student assessment data do not fully capture the actual school impact. Then the student assessment data also does not cover the full spectrum of outcomes of the school. The gaming, then there might potentially be gaming if there's stakes for the institutions, as when the results are provided publicly, so that the agents, in particular teachers and the school leaders, focus then on what is measured and engage in practices such as teaching to the test and narrowing the curriculum to all those areas that are tested. And then there might also be effects on hindering innovation in the school. So there are detrimental effects. So what shall we do? Essentially, you need to make sure if the country decides to publish, it needs to make sure that the measure is actually a good account of the impact of the school itself. And we do this by developing what we call value-added performance measures, where you pick up and identify what is the actual impact of the school on student learning outcomes. And then you also make sure that you reduce the potential detrimental effects. And you do this by trying to actually diversify the type of data you published, and to also publish alongside it qualitative type information, such as the one that comes from the school evaluation reports. Then a second aspect, a second major channel, is through the policy development, making sure that the data informs evidence, and if that evidence informs the development of the policies. So first of all, the first step is to make sure that you have a strategic approach to research. This involves creating actually education research institutes, such as in Korea, but it can also be research units within evaluation agencies or education administration, knowledge units to basically review the evidence in the literature, identify research gaps, commission papers from researchers, etc. Then the second step is to make sure that you actually involve the research community in the debates. That can be done through advisory groups, involve the researchers in the reforms themselves. That exchange with researchers can also be done at the school level, for instance, with the use of critical friends in schools in terms of using the evidence. A specialized evaluation agency, typically with technical leadership in the field, can also lead this process of developing evidence, and also engage in actually considerations about the state of education in the country in order to actually inform policy development. A third aspect is then, once you have your evidence and you developed your analysis, that you make sure that you use it to develop the policies. It can also be done through policy experimentation and pilots. And of course, very important, in order to develop consensus building among stakeholders and promote informed dialogue, you also need to disseminate this evidence so that the stakeholders themselves can use it, so that they can understand the rationale of reforms, and you can engage them in the dialogue. This also is valid for the level of practitioners with their involvement with the implementation of policies and their evaluation. Finally, a final channel through which student assessment data can have an impact is through the practices themselves. So it's much more localized in terms of channel. So you can actually take your infrastructure of indicators and data and develop in such a way that it's useful at the different levels. For instance, for education authorities, to have benchmarking analysis about the schools within a given local authority and compare it to other local authorities. Similarly, at the school level, you can prepare reports with your student assessment data at the school level with good benchmarking to other comparable schools, and schools can use that to actually develop their own school development plans. At the same time, at the teachers level, similarly, the information can be used at the class level, the student outcomes in standardized tests, as good diagnostic evidence. In this case, you need to be timely and provide quick feedback from those student assessment standardized tests so that you can actually use them quickly to improve the practices. Finally, an important reporting aspect is the reporting to parents. If you prepare the information properly in a way that is useful, meaning going beyond the marks, but actually getting to details of the strengths and areas of concern, the identified learning needs of students and recommendations for further learning, if you have that in the reporting to parents individually per student, this is a very good way of actually involving the parents in their children's learning and have them as basically partners of the learning itself. So this is, in a nutshell, very quickly, 3 major channels through which student assessment data can actually influence student outcomes, through policy development, through improvement of practices at local level, and through also the sharing of information more widely. So thank you very much for your attention, and I leave you with a few interesting links, including the last one, which is our own knowledge management and platform with all the work and results of education work at the OECD. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Paulo. You mentioned in your presentation the importance of information management systems, which leads me to a question: how digital education mainly changed things and perspectives in terms of education evaluation and strategic targets of education policymakers? And if you can focus on probably two things. The first is the supply and outcomes of education systems, and the second one is the demand shifts within the labor market, which is happening now more frequently.
I mean, there's essentially 2 aspects to your question. The first I understand is how to use the digital technology itself, meaning the skills you acquire through digital education, and what are the implications for assessment. I mean, for the assessment, it brings many benefits in terms of the accuracy of the assessment. For instance, ICT-based assessment allows you to go into a lot more detail in terms of the learning of the students through adaptive assessment, for instance. This is when the assessment itself and the next question depends on the previous responses. It can also improve the timeliness of the feedback, meaning the results become available much more quickly and the teacher can use it much more quickly. It also increases the analytical power of the data in terms of our ability to analyze it, in terms of processing the data, including big data, for instance, and also the availability in terms of the digital platforms that it can generate. The second aspect of the question is more about the digital education skills themselves, which are becoming more prominent in the different education systems. it's important that they become an important part of the curriculum, and that they're actually cross-curricular aspects related to digital education in every aspect of education. And this essentially implies developing, of course, targets for the learning of those skills, and adapt and also develop assessment tools also to measure those, including in terms of and this also has implications for the supply of programs, of course, not only at the school level, but also higher education level, and including because as a result of the demand of labor markets that you mentioned. And this brings, for instance, to prominence the importance of informing students and using actually assessment and the use of platforms to inform career guidance through basically platforms about labor market outcomes, for instance, so that they are informed to choose their careers at the university.
Sure. Another point I want to ask Dr. Paulo is, as we all know, there's an explosion of data happening worldwide. So from your experience, how does this steer the current understanding of our education systems, and maybe baselining the performance of those systems? And if you can give a few examples on how this helped different countries or organizations in developing their education policies or enhancing them or enhancing the outcome of those policies.
I mean, the fact that there's much greater availability of data has clearly led to one major development, which is the fact that the policy development itself can be much more evidence-based. But this also led to the lead of development capacity to analyze those data. And this includes actually the creation of agencies devoted to the use of data, to evaluation. And we've seen that in many countries, the creation of agencies that focus on evaluation and assessment in education. At the same time, that evidence leads clearly to a much more informed policy dialogue, which didn't exist without that evidence. And this supports, I mean, the governments in terms of building the rationale for their reforms, but also the arguments in how they actually discuss with the stakeholders. At the same time, it has really raised considerably the possibilities in terms of comparing, including comparing across countries. And you've seen the development in terms of international benchmarking that has the benefit to basically put a lot more attention, bring a lot more attention to education reforms, and basically improving the attention to education and leading to reforms. Another major development, of course, has been our ability to measure student learning outcomes themselves, and this has considerably improved in the last few years, brings the attention to the focal point of the analysis becomes the student learning outcomes, which is really the key thing we need to analyze. So the discussion turns around what really matters, and at the same time has allowed much more accountability to be introduced in the systems, and therefore has changed the shape and the type of discussion that exists. At the same time, we need to be careful with one particular development, which is the fact that we're developing a lot of data, focusing very much on measurement and developing of indicators, also brings risks, and brings risks in terms of simplifying too much the development of policy, or at least simplified uses of those data by looking at correlations and simple indicators and rankings. So we need to make sure that all this measurement that certainly policy is informed by quality data, but is not driven by their availability. There are many aspects that cannot be measured. So it's very important to engage in qualitative type of analysis, the secondary analysis of the data, and develop also narratives in terms of the processes at schools to complement this. So we need a broader approach to basically have a full picture of education systems in the world these days.
Very well said, Dr. Paulo. Thank you so much. We're moving now to our fourth session. It is my pleasure to introduce Dr. Shwetlena Sabarwal. Her presentation is titled The World Bank's Human Capital Index and the Importance of Metrics for Policy and Research. So Dr. Shwetlena is a senior economist at the World Bank, at the Education Global Practice World Bank. She was a principal author for the World Development Report 2019 on the changing nature of work. World Development Report 2018 on learning to realize education's promise, and World Bank's education policy guidance for COVID-19. She has published in leading journals in the areas of education, economics, and labor markets. In education, her research is on effort, mindsets, and incentives within education systems. In labor markets, her work has focused on entrepreneurship, gender, and networks. Shwetlena has led World Bank's education engagement in Uganda, Tanzania, Bangladesh, and Nepal. She holds a PhD in applied economics from University of Minnesota. Dr. Shwetlena.
Thank you so much. It's such a pleasure to be here. I'm really looking forward to discussing this with you, the audience, and also with the other esteemed panelists. So I'm actually going to talk more about some insights we've had in our work on how assessments can drive policy, better policy. So let's get into it. So I think the biggest insight, the most radical insight that we've had in the last few years on education is that when it comes to economic growth or economic development, it's not so much schooling that matters, it's actual learning, right? So learning outcomes are a much better predictor of economic growth and economic development than just years of schooling. Right? And the fact that we see this difference shows that just schooling does not always guarantee learning, right? And following from this, I think there has been in the last 2 decades much more emphasis on learning, which we were perhaps missing before this. And that emphasis on learning has led us to realize that learning outcomes are actually really low globally. And this is something that Silvia also alluded to, and the work that UNESCO has done on this has been really instrumental, and also the work that is being done by OECD and other organizations. So we see that when you look at both learning and schooling, right, not just years of schooling, you see that globally we have a lot of disparities, and they unfortunately seem to be regionally focused somewhat, right? And when you look at globally comparable learning data, you find some quite sort of depressing numbers. So you see, for instance, that a grade 8 student, okay, will know very different, will be at very different levels of proficiencies depending on where in the world he or she is, right? So the same grade, grade 8, will have different levels of proficiencies depending on which country you're in. And in some countries, a grade 8 student knows very little in terms of proficiency compared to students in the same grade in other countries. And this sort of difference is really startling, right? And we know this difference because we have looked at learning assessment data and we have compared learning assessment data across countries. Now, this in some sense is a static picture. And you could argue that now that we have this insight that learning is so important, are we making progress? Are we really changing things? Now, again, fortunately, the work done by OECD, for instance, allows us to compare learning outcome over time, right? Now, this is, again, still very imperfect, but you could, for instance, ask yourself that at the current rate of progress, how long would it take a country to go from low proficiency to high proficiency, right? So how long, for instance, would it take Indonesia, which by all accounts is not doing very badly in education? how long will it take Indonesia to reach the proficiency levels of an average OECD country, right? So an average developed country in Europe or North America. And when you do that, you actually find that the numbers are not great, right? So you see that it will take Indonesia at the current rate of change about 48 years to achieve the same proficiency level that an average OECD country has, and 74 in math and 74 years for reading, right? So not only is the static picture really depressing in some ways, the dynamic picture is also really concerning, right? So we are not making improvements at the rate that we need to make improvements. And this again echoes, I think, one of the figures that Silvia showed earlier about how much better we need to do to close learning gaps by 2030, which is the SDG target, and how poorly we are doing, relatively speaking. So then the question is, why is it that countries have spent so much money, so much energy, so much political commitment on education, and yet we have so little to show for it in terms of learning? And one argument that you can make is that the reason learning levels are relatively low and much behind the access levels is partly because learning has so far been very invisible, right? So we haven't really, historically speaking, spent as much time measuring learning, spent as much resources measuring learning as we should have done, right? So you can again see this when you ask, which countries have robust national assessment data. Now here, I'm not talking about global benchmark data. I'm just talking about national assessment data. And you would see that there are still many countries in different parts of the world who don't have national assessment data that can be really used for policy. And this gap is even bigger post-primary, right? So countries are more likely to have some assessment data at the primary level, but then less likely to have assessment data post-primary. And this really makes a difference, right? This makes learning invisible. And when learning is invisible, then you don't get the same attention, the same resources, the same political pressure, the same technical innovation in this area that you would have done if learning measures were available, right? So I'll show you this using a very simple example, okay? So in Africa, so we looked at 3 countries in East Africa, and there was these assessments done to look at the achievement level among grade 4 students, right? So grade 4 students were given a grade 2 math test, okay? A grade 2 math test. And you see that many grade 4 students could not pass a grade 2 math test. And this number is really terrible in places like Tanzania and Uganda, where only 21% or 26% of grade 4 students were able to pass a grade 2 math test, right? So when you look at a number like this, you would say, oh, there's a lot that needs to be done to improve education. But then when you ask parents if they're satisfied with education quality, you see that most parents are satisfied, right? And this is the gap that I'm talking about. Parents are satisfied because they don't know that learning is so low. And they don't know that learning is so low because the learning measurement has not been done and has not been reported and disseminated. So it sort of creates this lack of information, and then that translates into lack of accountability within the system, lack of pressure within the system to improve learning. So we need to make learning visible, right? And the way to make learning visible is to have good, useful, over time learning measures. And there are 3 or 4 things that learning measures can do that make a huge difference in how education systems operate. So the first thing that they do is that learning measurement creates a culture of transparency and accountability within the education system. Now, in order to think about it, for accountability, we also need to be able to communicate the gaps in learning in a sort of really understandable way to the general public, to also to the policymakers, right? We cannot always be talking in very complicated technical language. We have to have a language for learning that is easily accessible for everybody. So some work that I have been involved in is this work on learning adjusted years of schooling. So the idea here is that we look at the years of schooling, which are very widely reported. And UNESCO actually reports the expected years of schooling for nearly all countries. And then you adjust those years of schooling for the quality of schooling, right? So this is related to the example that I showed you earlier, that how much is a year of schooling getting you in terms of actual learning, right? And when you do that exercise, when you adjust the years of schooling for learning, you see that you can actually quantify the gap, right? Especially when you compare this with the most high performing countries, right? So a year of schooling is getting you some level of skills in Switzerland or in Sweden, and they're not getting you the same level of skills elsewhere. So that kind of gap can be quantified, and you can see the gap to the frontier in the orange part of the bars. And that actually gives a framework, that gives a very easy language for policymakers, but also for the general public to understand how much more needs to be done and to track progress, right? So create accountability, but also create a sense of progress and a sense of improvement and change. So we think that this tool can sort of really help make learning visible, right? And this has then been used in the World Bank's Human Capital Index. So I'm not going to go into that, but Human Capital Index sort of looks at health and education and combines health and education measures to see how much is the country doing in terms of using its health and education systems to improve the productivity of future generations. And it gives you, again, a sense from the frontier, how far is the country from the frontier. But for the education part of the Human Capital Index, the learning adjusted years of schooling are the main ingredient. The other thing that metrics can do, learning measurement can do, is that it can reveal the inequalities within the system, right? So it's not just important to think about how is the average child doing or how is the system on the whole. It's also important to look within the system and see who is lagging behind, right? And learning measurement work that has been done has been really instrumental in seeing how some countries could be doing better, but are much more unequal within, right? So for instance, here I show how PISA data can be used to see how much inequality there is within the system and how different systems should be evaluated and should be held accountable, not just to have high levels of learning, but to have high levels of learning for all, have low inequality. And this concern is even more heightened with COVID-19, as you can imagine. Now, the final point that I want to make here is the very latest work that I've been involved in, which is to say, you know, can we also then use learning measurement much more directly for policy making and for guiding policy investments, right? So here what we've done is we have so much more information now from evaluations of education interventions. Now, as you can imagine, every government has limited resources, but then they have so many different types of investments that they can make, so many different types of policies and interventions that they can do. So how to decide what to do? Now, we can then use learning measures much more proactively to guide that decision making. So here what we are doing is we are looking at 150 education interventions that have good evaluation data, and we are translating the education impacts in terms of learning adjusted years of schooling gained, right? So then we can compare different interventions on a standardized metric and say, how many years of schooling, learning adjusted years of schooling, right? So learning quality years of schooling do you get through this investment, right? And using that metric, you can compare different investments. And you can do this even more effectively go a step further and compare different interventions on cost effectiveness. So not just effectiveness, but cost effectiveness. So how much more learning adjusted years of schooling are you getting through a particular intervention per dollar spent, right? Now, I want to echo Paul here. Paul had just mentioned that we also have to be careful when we use measurement in this way, because we cannot be simplistic about it. We have to, this is just one ingredient. This is just one guide. We have to then look at this guide in context. We have to contextualize it with local factors. We have to take into consideration many, many other things like feasibility, context, political acceptability, and so on. So this is not to say that we should just use this one thing to guide all education investments, but it can be a very useful tool to be in the mix, right? So a really quantitative, measurement-driven information point that governments can use when they're deciding where to spend their money. So in summary, in order to improve economic growth and economic development, we have to improve learning. There's no other way. And in order to improve learning, we have to make learning visible. It has to be visible to people. It has to be visible to policymakers. And that is where learning measurement is a really, really important tool. So I'll stop there. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Shwetlena. Early in your presentation, you depicted a very depressing piece of information. It would take Indonesia half a century to catch up with average developed countries in OECD. So what should we do?
So yeah, no, it is depressing, but I think the first step to solving the problem is to know that there is a problem, and is to measure the extent of the problem. And that is, I think, what we are doing increasingly well. And conferences like this, discussions with policymakers like this are a great step. Now, what a country needs to do, I think, has to be driven by not just learning measurement information, but then also a better understanding of contextual features. And here I mentioned some of them. So one is to understand inequality within the system, right? So is it that the average child is doing poorly, or is it that there are a huge inequalities and disparities within the system? And then we have to look at the causes, right? So in World Bank's World Development Report 2018, we really discuss how countries can start solving the problem of the learning crisis. And here, we have to look at two layers. The first layer will be the education system layer. And here you have four ingredients. You have the school inputs, you have the teachers, you have the early childhood investment. So how prepared are children to learn? And finally, you have system level factors. So you have to look at each of those factors, see what the country is doing, see where it's lacking, and also see the global evidence on what are the best ways to prepare teachers, what are the best ways to prepare head teachers, and so on. But then I think a lot of times what World Development Report shows that it goes a level deeper than that also, which is that you have to look at whether the system is aligned towards learning, right? So all education systems have so many different parts. And sometimes what happens is that these complicated, different small parts start to work for their own goals, which are smaller, right? And they're not aligned together. So is your curriculum subsystem and your teacher training subsystem and your student assessment subsystem, are they all aligned? Are they talking to each other? Are they all aligned to the same goal of learning? So I think countries also have to do a lot of thinking at that level. So those would be my big recommendations, which are threefold. Look at where learning is falling short, right? So really analyze your learning assessment data. Then look at your education systems and look at the four important parts of the education system. And then go one layer deeper and look at the alignment of the different subsets within the education and broader system. Thanks.
Sure. Another follow-up question. Also, I noticed you mentioned that in one of the charts that you showed is that some African countries have very low learning adjusted years of school. Is this really because that the education output is not of a high quality, or is that because of, for instance, lack of data? So data is not there, so we were not able to measure an actual or an accurate number.
Yeah, no, that's a great question. I think for sub-Saharan Africa specifically, the first thing we have to realize is that sub-Saharan Africa is one area where still years of schooling, so just access to schooling is still low, right? So there are millions of children who are still out of school. So when you look at the learning adjusted years of schooling, they're both ingredients are low, right? So learning is low, but so are years of schooling also low, right? So Africa has to make improvements on both dimensions. Whereas in contrast, if you think about Latin America or you think about Middle East and North Africa, you know, their years of schooling are quite high. Learning is where they need to improve. So with Africa, it's both. And then in terms of why learning is low, certainly learning measurement is below par. There much more needs to be done to measure learning. But I also think that it's the combination of a lack of resources as well, right? So their systems are still struggling with having adequate amounts of inputs. And then there are also some system level factors with accountability and incentives and so on.
Great, thank you so much, Dr. Shwetlena. Okay, our last but not least session, we have with us Dr. Nayyaf Aljabri. It's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Nayyaf, and the title of his presentation will be Maximizing Education and Training Evaluation Commission Impact, Leveraging Data in a Holistic Approach. Dr. Nayyaf is the General Manager of Research and Innovation. He has extensive academic, practical, and professional experience. He is currently the General Director of Research and Innovation at the Education and Training Evaluation Commission. Throughout his career, Dr. Nayyaf has held a number of positions, including Deputy Minister for Planning and Development and Deputy Minister for Education at the Ministry of Education, Dean of College of Education at Taybeh University. He has also led several developmental projects at the national level, both at Taybeh University and at the Ministry of Education. He was a member of several boards of directors in ministries and government agencies, and in boards of trustees and advisory boards of universities. Dr. Nayyaf received a PhD in economics of education from the University of Manchester, UK. His research interests included education economics and policies, and the application of quantitative methods to evaluate different alternatives on how to employ educational resources and improve cost effectiveness and performance of educational institutions. He published over 15 research papers and participated in a number of research projects nationally. Dr. Nayyaf taught over 10 courses at master's and PhD levels and discussed many academic theses, of which he supervised 20. Dr. Nayyaf.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Dr. Sattam. I'm so glad to be in front of you this afternoon as in this well-respected panel with His Excellency Dr. Tareq Alshedi and Dr. Sattam Alsubaiee from Artificial from the Saudi Commission for Data and Artificial Intelligence. I'm so prestigious to be with you. Dr. Silvia Montoya from there, from Canada, Dr. Paulo Santiago from Paris, and Dr. Shwetlena Sabarwal from the United States. Please allow me, my colleague from outside the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, and all of our all of the international audience to speak in Arabic language. It might be easy for me at the end of the session to speak in my mother tongue. السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته مرة أخرى، والعرض سيكون عن توسيع.
Peace be upon you all. Again, my presentation will be about expanding the impact of our work and the holistic overview of dealing with the TVTC's work and data. Our work is not only about ethics work is not only about evaluation and assessment, but also the impact should be related to taking care of the data of evaluation, the reports, and the results of the data should be available for researchers so that every researcher will find it and tackle it from his own theoretical angle so that the impact will be wider and broader. We will be also speaking about data of uh, ETEC and the strategy of ETEC in terms of data and how do we govern data and the international and national partnerships, also enabling and empowering researchers and related parties. Also, we will speak about some of the dashboards that were provided and developed at ETEC so far. I may start speaking about what we mean by the comprehensive or holistic um, frame of data that should have three main things: a platform that contains and the main basic abilities like the databases and the integration of data, the quality assurance of data, and the governance as well. Also, the second main component is the science of data and the analytical uh, powers or capabilities, whether descriptive or forecasting or directive advanced abilities from the different angles of machine learning or other analytical uh, empowerment. And at the end of the presentation, we will be speaking about some dashboards that will explain this. The third main important is how to present the information using AI technologies and the information boards and the visualization of data, whether advanced or simple. And this shape or this figure sums up our idea. We have the three main components: the platform, of data, the science of data, the presentation of data, and we will have the main components of every one of them and how we tackle this situation in our platform. In our platform of data, we have the uh, decisions that we work on, and also in terms of the data science, we work on the tactic decisions that we can listen from in order to pave the way for the leaders of education in different levels to benefit from these data in order to improve their educational processes. And also in the data presentation component, we benefit from AI and integration of data, and we present data in different uh, options and alternatives, and this will lead us to different strategic decisions on the national level in terms of the evaluation of training and education data. Also, we can here stop for a moment and speak about some things what that was said about the importance of data. It is no secret that data is very important with what we are witnessing in the whole world now. For example, the UNESCO said that data of learning data, when connected to other things like social context, learning and education environment, and the features of learner, may help disclose the different factors that impact the outcomes. And as Dr. Paulo Santiago said, he uncovered some of these things and the work of OECD and what they have provided, and also Dr. Silvia Montoya and Dr. Paulo also mentioned a lot of these things. This is a good idea for evidence-based change in order to have the data and in order to do our best to find the evidence. Data will help us achieve that evidence, especially if we have measurement for the inputs and the outputs, and if data is distinguished by being practical or experiential, not only just theoretical or general data. So the experience should be natural and normal. Also, other things, Audrey Waters said that analyzing these data is an integral tool that we need in order to enhance the learning outcomes. These are also some of the different uses for data: to measure the outputs of training and education, to conform to meet the needs of the labor market, also to achieve the competencies and to study the impactful factors in the training and education system in general, and to pave the way for improving and bridge the gaps in the future. Some of the gaps are related, as mentioned by the World Bank presentation a while ago. Also, this is our diagnosis for the current situation in ethics data scene. We have in the middle the internal sources of ETEC, because we have four main centers that do or perform the data collection. We have the National Center for Measurement, National Center for uh, Evaluation and School Excellence. We have the National Center for Academic Accreditation. We have also the National Center for Training, Accreditation, and Evaluation. Also, on the other side, we have data that we collect from different ministries, like the Ministry of Education, the TVTC, the Human Resources Developmental Fund from the Ministry of Human Resources, and other measures of the impact of education on the different levels. Also, the Saudi Authority for Data and Artificial Intelligence, the National Statistics Authority in Saudi Arabia. In addition to partnerships with international organizations, we have also, like OECD, we have partnerships to build databases, but we have other partnerships with other organizations that work on international studies and international research, which is an important source to meet their needs in terms of data. And we are building our stores of data in our ethics facilities. Also, analyzing the most important beneficials of our data, we have governmental entities, the board of directors, we have the different directories of ethics, we have the governmental entities, we have the training and education service providers on different levels, on the national level, on the level of the Ministry of Education, on the level of TVTC, on different levels of other agencies, also on the level of on the tactic level of educational directories or schools. And we also have the international organizations and the research centers, as well as the researchers themselves and the research groups. We provide them with the data that they want, and this will be improved even much more in the future. Also, students, trainees, and they are provided with a profile of data. They can review the things that relate to them. Also, parents, which is an important segment of our beneficiaries. And also, we have the bigger society in general when we publish the information or the data of evaluation, in order to guide the decisions for the social or family or institutional levels. So, our vision and ETEC is to provide screens of data that are updated, holistic, and precise, reports that have the same qualities. Also, we have the same qualities in our unified standard data. Also, advanced and basic analytical results. We have international benchmarks and comparisons that are up to date and reliable, also providing analytical tools that will be basic and advanced. On the margin of this conference, there were more than 20 training workshops that were held, training the beneficiaries on the data of ethics and how to use them. And there were a lot of researchers who attended from in and out of the kingdom. This is about our strategy in ETEC, which is accredited by the board of directors of ETEC, and it confirms clearly that in the fourth strategic goal that it is important to have data and to have the main steps to work on data, and based on that we will develop our frame of data in ETEC. And generally speaking, when we speak about these different steps, the process starts with collecting data and analyzing them, and also formulating the stores department, then analyzing basic analysis, then the design of standards and methodologies. After that, the machine learning and AI, which is the advanced analytic. After that, presenting and publishing the results. After that, we make available the data that are open source and can be accessed by researchers, or even some of the restricted data in order to be controlled and can be available for specific researchers or specific sectors or governmental entities other than TVTC. This happens under control and governance and improvement of quality, and also in terms of training and knowledge transfer in both inside and outside ETEC facilities related to training our staff and training researchers and beneficiaries of our data, whether individual researchers or in institutions or organizations. In terms of the governance of the data and the access to data, we will commit to what is accredited by or approved by our cybersecurity authority. We have different levels of data. We have private data for the users, which clarify the identity of individuals. These are considered only related to that specific related person. After that, we have the level of data that has restricted access, only available for governmental or semi-governmental or legal personality agencies. Also, we have data that will be shared with society directly with the agencies or governmental agencies or society as a whole to help them do their work. Also, we have open source data that does not have any private information about individuals or the work of institutions in different sectors. So there is no harm of sharing this data with researchers and others. Some of them will be like KPIs and reports that will be used in the boards of information. Some of them will be scheduled, some of them may be detailed on the minor level in order to be beneficial for the researchers of different organizations that need to do research in these fields. Also, this is a glimpse of those who are working with our partners, Ministry of Education, TVTC, the Expenditure Efficiency Achievement Office, OECD, also the ETEC partnership with them in order to expand the impact of ETEC work. The National Authority of Statistics, we benefit from their work and they benefit from ours as well, different reports that we issue. And also in terms of choosing the samples, the National Center for measuring the performance of governmental bodies, the Saudi Data Authority and the Saudi Observatory of Work and the Saudi Intellectual Property Authority, in terms of patents for the employees of the higher education facilities and institutions. Now we'll move to the part before the last one, which is related to the strategies that we're working on, because we think it is a strong and a direct tool that will help us expand our work and the impact of our work, and will help us find the science evidence that will enable us to build our policies upon. Also, the evaluation data for us are considered high quality or high impactful data because they are based on natural or normal actual experiences. When I say actual or normal experiences, when students go through a specific test on a broad level in Saudi Arabia, it is natural because students have already done this test. So we will have two measures for the outputs and measures for the inputs and the processes, and this will enable us do these advanced analytical processes. And at the end of the day, the data will be actual because no one will affect the distribution of the students, and these will be high level of reliability, and they will be also presentable, length, and also important. Also, ETEC works well on the topic of research, and that started years ago. Some of the research that we have done is related to developing the mechanisms of measurement, assessment, and evaluation, also developing the processes of evaluation. There are other works of research related to the educational process itself, what's going on inside this classrooms, inside schools, inside facilities, also related to educational policies. Also, there are services related to providing data, raw data, to for the researchers, also artificial intelligence and AI basic analytical tools that will be provided to the researchers, and researchers will be helped in terms of how to work and how to start working on the precise data. And this is through providing a platform for discovering or exploring data. Here, for example, we find research work that was published since 2012 to 2020, 45 research papers that are governed and controlled, based on half of them was published in maybe upper tier kinds of magazines or scientific magazines around the world. These methodological research was based on the reports or data of ETEC. We have more than 300 research works based on our data through the recent years. These are some examples of the reports that we have issued. We have a list of 10 reports. Some of them are here now. For example, how are they categorized on the dashboard so that researchers and or beneficiaries can view them as they are on the board of KPIs or PIs, and so, they will find what they want in terms of these data. For example, the status of education report, the first version was in 2019. We have here, for example, the index 22-18. This is for the number of population and the population of between 18 to 22 years old, males and females, the number of higher education students. The males were, for example, 66.7% in 2016, while females were 66.5%. In 2018, we have different levels. Females are 68.9% and males are 66.4%, which is a higher level of enrollment for public education in Saudi Arabia. This is an example of the reports indexes that we have about the current situation of education in Saudi Arabia. Here we have another example, which is related to the competencies of teachers test. There was, in 2018, we have some kind of lowering in the numbers compared to 2016, because teachers have different disciplines, we have different kinds of these tests. This is, for example, the acceptance index of the performance of data and the achievement tests and the competencies test after high school, and the performance of each school. If there are enough number of students in a school, it will be considered in this index. Here, for example, in Riyadh, the best schools in Riyadh in different years, and we can find data that about private schools or public schools or all of them, male students, female students. We have different options of presentation of data. Here, for example, we can choose the map of the cities, different regions and cities of Saudi Arabia. We can zoom in and out and find the different indexes of different schools of different regions. If parents, for example, want to go to a specific city, or at the beginning of the year, if the parent wants to find a good school for his children, he can find the different data that will help them do that. So these are helpful tools that will enable on different levels, and this is very helpful for parents. And on different levels, they help the leaders of the schools. Also, they help the leaders of the Ministry of Education. This is another example of dashboards to publish the results of the school's evaluation process that was started by ETEC through Excellence Center for more than 700 schools to measure their performance in general according to the standards. And this is a specification of the different levels of schools that we can choose using the field, using the region, using the geographical region, the type of school. These different options are available for beneficiaries to easily navigate data according to their own goals and expectations. They will find these tools very helpful. Also, another example related to the level of performance for students in the national tests, which is the national evaluation or assessment of the test results for science and maths. For example, we have here categorization of the different results of students, and we can see here or notice that female students, for example, are better in terms of results compared to male students. Here, for example, we have an example of advanced analytics. This is about the performance of Saudi Arabia students in PISA 2019 and their distribution according to the different levels of performance. And here, if we want to compare Saudi Arabia's students to others in terms of the difference between girls and boys' performance in Saudi Arabia compared to OECD countries, here Saudi Arabia, if you notice, is we have a huge difference between males and females. All over the world, boys do better in maths more than girls, but in Saudi Arabia, it's the opposite. And here we find an indication. As I mentioned before, we have different analytical processes. This is an indication that connects the different economic ideas and the performance of our country on an average in PISA exam, for example. If we have this line in the middle, we found Saudi Arabia is considered like a negative residual, as if we would say that Saudi Arabia's students do not do or perform well as expected according to our economic expectations. That this will be an important index, that Saudi Arabia does not perform well in PISA compared to our expenditure in education and our social status. Thank you very much for listening, and sorry for speaking too long.
It's very entertaining to see the Saudi experience when it comes to the evaluation of education. If you allow me, we'll spend a couple of minutes to take the questions from our viewers, which we thank them. We received tens of questions, and our colleagues did a great job in ordering them and clustering them. And I'll just ask them without specific format. So I'll just read those questions. So there's a question for Dr. Silvia. The viewer says, what does learning assessment data reveal so far in terms of progress to achieving the Education 2030 agenda, particularly with regards to the MENA region? Dr. Silvia?
Yes, thank you so much. And that's quite a good question. I think it was a good elaboration. Unfortunately, the data shows to us that we're not progressing at a pace that is good, so enough. We have still many excluded kids that we are actually thinking that they are not acquiring the learning skills, but also the systems are not showing enough improvement. We really need to do a huge effort, and especially in the kids that are the most disadvantaged. So the data shows that the progress is really not good, and for the reason, this is a concern of all of us regarding that. Thank you.
All right, thank you. Another question in different matter, Dr. Paulo. A viewer is asking, how can the research communities be engaged in support of evidence-based policies and practices?
Thank you for the question. Very good question. I mean, in a range of ways. First of all, by being provided access to the data that is generated by the system. So all issues about privacy of data need to be dealt with in the systems, and then restricted use options could be provided to the researchers, so having access to the raw data to actually perform research. Also being provided incentives by the education authorities themselves that can have education research plans, whereby they commission research to education researchers. And then generally as advisors in advisory groups to implement particular types of policies in which they're experts, and more generally also in following reforms and evaluating the implementation of those reforms.
Great, amazing. Thank you, Doctor. Another question, this time is for Dr. Shwetlena. So I think it's a great question. So the viewer is asking, how can global metrics be made more accessible to students, parents, and schools in order to convey important information on the quality of education? And do you have examples of initiatives that aim to engage key stakeholders, inform them of their performance based on global metrics, and empower them with the information to affect change?
It's a great question. It's also a tough question. I hope my other panelists can also come in if needed. So I think global metrics can play a role. Like you said, I think they can create this surge, right, of pressure from the ground up. A key ingredient for that would be dissemination, right? So the one thing global metrics need to do is that not only should they be transparent and meaningful, they should also be intuitive. People should be able to understand what they mean. And I think sometimes the global community emphasizes so much the first part, but doesn't emphasize so much the easy understandability, the intuitiveness of the measure. And then, I think the global community and the local community has to then invest in dissemination, right? Which I think we're getting much better at. We have more tools now than we used to earlier. We have social media, and young people have much more access to these tools than they used to have. And there's also average level of education is higher. So I think if we construct the metrics right and we invest in dissemination, I think it will reach people. In terms of local salience, I really like the point that Paulo made earlier. It has to be a combination of global and local, right? It cannot just be what the country is doing as a whole. I think people are much more likely to respond when it is also linked to their community, their state, their schools. So I think people should find a balance between those two. If people are only communicating global, then a lot of people, local people may feel, this is not something where I can intervene. And the final point that I will make is that doing more, it's not only about disseminating what we produce, it's also about involving local policymakers and local community in the conversation, right? So it has to be a conversation. So we have to give local stakeholders a way to respond back to us. And I think, again, we're getting better and better. And some of the work that I know Silvia is leading does involve making sure that the voices that have been excluded so far are included in this discussion. Thank you.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Dr. Shwetlena. Your Excellency, Dr. Tareq, I received a couple of questions. People seems to be excited about the role of NDMO. I'll just read two questions. I think they are related to each other. So the first is what are the measures being taken by the Saudi Data and AI Authority to encourage the use of data by various stakeholders? Is data freely available? Second question is, does SADAIA, Saudi Data and AI Authority, play a role in overseeing the use of personal data by the private sector?
Let me start with the second question. For the person, this is actually, if we go back to the two main function for the NDMO, is the data management and personal data protection. So for the data management, actually, it's cover only the government agencies, but for the personal data protection, actually, we cover both the public entities and private sector. So yes, we oversee the both of them.
Great, amazing. The first question was related to, is data freely available? I think they
Actually, we are only 1 year old, so don't rush for that. So we have the open data policy now, and it's it should be in effective now. Also, we have the more important one is the data sharing policy. Data sharing policy will ensure that the data will be shared by the government entities. So the question here, and this is the important part of it, actually, people, entrepreneurs looking for the data, most likely from the private sector. And in fact, until now, we don't have a mandate over the data of the private sector. But we are trying to ease the process. So we leave it to the sectors themselves to arrange that.
Great. دكتور نياف، السؤال هذا يعني أعتقد سؤال مهم جدا. الأخ الكريم يسأل: ما هي المناهج التي تتبعها السعودية ودول العالم لمواجهة التداعيات المستقبلية لأزمة كورونا؟
The question is about what are the regulations that are traced by Saudi Arabia in order to avoid the ambiguity and the COVID-19 crisis, and what is the impact of the COVID-19 process? What is the impact of COVID-19 on the evaluation process of education, and how can we focus on that in terms of the what we talked about here in the session? Thank you, Dr. Sattam. I think the data process can be different, but there is an experience for ETEC that should be available, and it was mentioned yesterday in the opening speech of the conference by His Excellency, the Chairman of the Board of Directors of ETEC, regarding online or remote working and evaluation using AI and the modern technologies, which was a unique experience globally. And another thing, our colleagues in the National Center for Evaluation and Academic Accreditation are performing evaluation for the programs and of the institutions of higher education online and remotely without any problem. If there is a need for a field visit, they use the modern telecommunication technologies for that goal. There is a lesson that we learned from COVID-19, and the whole world learned that lesson, that education and evaluation should continue to exist. And another thing that is important is that the world should learn that it is time to make sure that educational systems all over the world need to develop their systems to be ready for any crisis. We are speaking about things that we are witnessing now, programming of education, and the thing that we need. When the crisis occurred, we discovered that the whole world was not as ready as it was expected. Maybe the COVID crisis may be a good opportunity for the whole world to create better data that will help them get better in the future.
We are concluding our session, ladies and gentlemen. I would like to thank the audience for bearing with us this evening during this rich thematic session. I also would like to thank the Education and Training Evaluation Commission for organizing this conference. And also, I would like to quote Dr. Shwetlena. She said, learning is invisible. And I think she also said data and metrics will make the learning visible. So with that, we conclude our session. Thank you so much to all of you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
شكرا معاليكم. Thank you, Your Excellency. حضورنا الكرام, our distinguished guests. شكرا لحسن استماعكم. بهذا تنتهي جلستنا ما قبل الختامية في المؤتمر الدولي لتقويم التعليم والتدريب. نلقاكم في الجلسة الختامية ومراسم اختتام المؤتمر بعد توقف قصير قدره 5 دقائق. Thank you for your participation in the session. We will meet you again for our final session after a 5-minute short break. Thank you.